Target pemerintah untuk mencapai produksi migas sebesar 1 juta barel per hari minyak bumi dan 12 miliar kaki kubik per hari gas bumi pada 2030 dapat tercapai dengan adanya komitmen bersama di antara seluruh pemangku kepentingan baik di dalam maupun di luar sektor energi. Indonesia diketahui memiliki 128 cekungan migas yang memiliki potensi sangat besar. Dari jumlah tersebut, terdapat 20 cekungan yang sudah berproduksi, 27 yang telah ditemukan namun belum berproduksi, 68 yang belum dibor, dan 13 lainnya yang belum ditemukan. Dari kondisi tersebut, diyakini prospek industri hulu migas Indonesia di masa mendatang masih sangat baik. Sejumlah proyek migas berskala besar juga saat ini sedang dikerjakan. Di antaranya, Eni Merakes di Kalimantan Timur, Saka Kemang di Sumatera Selatan, Pertamina Jambaran Tiung Biru di Jawa Tengah, dan Tangguh Train 3 di Papua. Untuk mencapai target 1 juta barel minyak bumi dan 12 miliar kaki kubik gas bumi dimaksud, sejumlah program telah disepakati untuk dilaksanakan. Di antaranya, menjaga tingkat produksi yang ada saat ini atau maintaining base production, mempercepat waktu yang diperlukan untuk memproses dari cadangan menjadi produksi atau transformation reserve to production, mengimplementasikan program EOR atau Enhanced Oil Recovery, meningkatkan aktivitas eksplorasi pada lapangan yang baru atau New Exploration. Adanya target yang telah ditetapkan dan kenyataan bahwa Indonesia masih memiliki cadangan migas yang cukup besar, maka industri hulu migas nasional diyakini masih akan memegang peranan yang cukup signifikan dalam pemenuhan energi di Indonesia pada masa mendatang. Hal ini juga selaras dengan bauran energi yang ditetapkan dalam Rencana Umum Energi Nasional (RUEN) pada 2015 yang lalu. Menurut RUEN, sumber energi dari minyak dan gas bumi pada tahun 2025 nanti masih mendominasi sebesar 47%, yaitu 25% dari minyak bumi dan 22% gas bumi. Angka tersebut tidak akan jauh berubah pada 2050, yaitu sebesar 44%, yang terdiri dari 20% minyak bumi dan 24% gas bumi. Dengan rasa optimis, Indonesian Petroleum Association (IPA) akan tetap mengadakan acara rutin tahunan yang dikenal dengan pameran dan konvensi atau IPA Convex pada 1 hingga 3 September 2021 mendatang secara online.
by net zero targets. As you can see, Europe is setting the pace, with the European majors being the first to set meaningful targets for Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions as they pivot towards the energy transition. On the other hand, the US major oil and gas companies continue to target production growth over the next decade, while making less ambitious Scope 1 and 2 emission reductions. It's a perfectly defensible argument that the world will continue to need new supply over the next decade, but it's very hard to grow production whilst also reducing emissions. The majors are investing in a wide range of low carbon technologies, including renewables, CCS and CCUS, blue and green hydrogen, EV charging, and even wider customer offerings. But many of these technologies are not commercial today and will require years to, if not decades, to reach industrial scale. Now, for some companies, shrinking the upstream business may well become part of meeting emission goals. Indeed, BP is targeting a 40% reduction in its oil and gas output over the next decade to meet its 35 to 40% Scope 3 emission reduction target. We'll see capital being reallocated away from oil and gas, with implications for countries still reliant on their oil and gas sectors to provide government revenues, job creation, and the supply of reliable and affordable energy. So there's huge external pressure pushing the upstream industry to decarbonise, but that's just part of the story. There are also a number of pull factors. Now, at Wood Mackenzie, we've grouped these pull factors or these drivers into three general categories. First up, public perception. These are the factors that include those external pressures, such as greater environmental and ESG scrutiny, concerns from investors and the financing community, and perhaps retaining or being able to retain the social license to operate. Next up, best practice. Now, these are the factors that are increasingly becoming just part of the standard oil and gas toolset. So, for example, reducing flaring, venting and leaks, improving production or processing efficiencies, or reducing in-field fuel use through alternative or greener power sources. And thirdly, there's the factors that we could consider a source of commercial advantage. These are factors that create that additional competitive advantage as perhaps buyers of oil and gas products distinguish between dirtier and clean products. The factors that future-proof portfolios from the risk of tighter regulation or carbon charges, or that help maintain access to capital markets and investors. Now, the key message here is that there are a number of different factors driving decarbonisation in the oil and gas sector, and it's really important that these are fully understood when determining new policy and new regulation. Now, thinking about the where, looking in more detail at upstream emissions, there are a number of different sources of emissions for the oil and gas sector, and each project, each country, and each region has its own emissions profile. Therefore, there's no real one-size-fits-all solution to decarbonisation. Now, I think the chart on the left shows from Wood Mackenzie's emissions benchmarking tool, Scope 1 and 2 emissions intensity by region and emission type, with a clear range of intensities depending on the maturity, the regulatory framework in place, and also the typical project profile for each region. So we can see at the right-hand side of the chart there, Europe has the lowest intensity, which reflects, existing regulation and policy frameworks that have been in place for several years. The Middle East is close behind Europe. On absolute terms, the Middle East is actually one of the largest, if not the largest, emitter in terms of overall emissions. But on an intensity basis, it's actually comparable with Europe, reflecting the huge volumes of product that are produced in the Middle East. At the other end of the scale, we have Oceania, we have Africa and Asia that have relatively high levels of intensity, reflecting either a high proportion of liquefaction facilities in the example of Australia, or perhaps a limited policy and regulatory focus up until now on flaring or the venting of CO2. If we drill down into Indonesia, the mature nature of the country's sector and what we would argue would be limited regulatory focus on emissions reduction is reflected in a comparably high level of emissions intensity. So a lot for Indonesia to go after. And again, understanding the source of a country's emissions is important in determining where policy needs to focus. So how are upstream operators looking to reduce emissions? Well, with production and processing fuel requirements accounting for over 50% of upstream Scope 1 and 2 emissions, electrification of upstream operations using low carbon energy sources appears to have huge potential. And one of the standout examples here is perhaps demonstrated by Norway, where 50% of oil and gas production will be fully electrified by 2025, which means that operators can sell more of the hydrocarbons they produce while reducing emissions. But Norway's got a couple of structural advantages which make it difficult for other countries to follow its lead. First of all, 95% of Norway's power is generated from clean, green hydropower, which provides an ample supply of low carbon power for upstream operations. And secondly, Norway introduced a carbon tax on flaring as far back as 1991 and incorporated the EU emissions trading scheme from 2008, which provides a clear incentive for operators to invest in emissions reduction projects to reduce tax and carbon trading liabilities. Now, these clear policies have led to Norway's success in reducing emissions. Indeed, the country has recently offered its first carbon neutral oil cargoes from its flagship Johan Sverdrup field. But it's not been an overnight success. It's taken years of consistent and considered policy making. Few countries will be able to replicate Norway's success in this area. Carbon capture is perhaps a more realistic option for other countries, and given it requires similar skills to drilling for oil and gas, it's no surprise that this is where many operators are focusing their efforts. 2021 may yet prove to be a breakout year for carbon capture and sequestration. CCS can be used to develop discovered resources with high levels of CO2. It can be used as a means to offset carbon emissions produced elsewhere, or it can be used as a way of enhancing oil recovery, although the jury is still out on whether the latter is really truly storage, as not all CO2 injected for EOR would necessarily be permanently captured. However, we believe that significant regulatory, commercial and technical hurdles are being underestimated when it comes to making CCS a key part of the oil and gas sector's decarbonisation journey. Hitting CCS targets will be very challenging without the right support. In our accelerated energy transition 2 scenario, this is where we see global warming limited to 2 degrees. We estimate carbon capture and sequestration capacity will need to rise from 40 million tonnes per annum currently to around 7 billion tonnes per annum by 2050, which is a huge increase on our base case outlook, which you can see in the light blue line on the chart. Now, the number of planned CCS projects has ballooned in recent years from 50 in 2019 to nearly 300 today. And it's a huge growth opportunity for the oil and gas sector, but the industry can't do it itself. To support investment in CCS, governments need to provide clear regulation to cover sequestration, to cover licensing, carbon accreditation, and the ultimate liability for any leakage risk. Fiscal incentives and government funding are also critical if CCS is to move from being viewed as a cost to a potential source of commercial value for operators and governments. Indonesia has a huge opportunity to become a first mover in carbon sequestration, given the profile and potential of flagship projects such as Repsol's Sakakamang CCS development. But the policy and regulatory framework also needs to be supportive. And perhaps carbon pricing is a key part of this puzzle. Now, just over a third of global emissions are now subject to carbon pricing. 2 options exist for imposing carbon charges to reduce emissions. Firstly, carbon taxes, which are effectively a fixed charge or a tax applied directly on all CO2 emissions. Now, specific projects can be granted an emissions allowance, so that only emissions more than that allowance are subject to tax. And we've seen this implemented in places like Norway or Canada. The second method of charging for carbon emissions would be emission trading schemes. And this is where emission credits are granted by the government and used to cover emissions. And these credits can then be traded to acquire additional offsets or to sell surplus credits to generate a revenue. Trading schemes are often more complex than carbon taxes. But the number of sort of free credits awarded can be gradually reduced over time, and then prices are dictated by the auction market. This actually incentivizes activity to reduce emissions. There's been limited application, however, of either system, but pressure is building on all governments and countries to consider these schemes. And on pricing, we've estimated that the global average carbon price is currently around $21 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And with about 20% of emissions are now subject to a carbon price above $40 per ton, all of which are under European regimes. So we've actually got very few major oil and gas producing regions subject to carbon charges at rates of $20 per ton or higher. And in Asia, of the existing schemes in place, primarily focused in China, the average price of carbon is around $8 per ton of CO2 equivalent. Policymakers must therefore be clear on the method of carbon charging, how it will apply to existing operators, and how the system will interact with existing fiscal frameworks. And as is always the case, investors crave clarity and certainty that allow for major investments to be made over significant time horizons. Now, coming to my final slide, perhaps the elephant in the room, and the one thing I haven't really mentioned, is Indonesia's production targets. Hopefully we'll hear more on that as the panel presents their arguments. It goes without saying that aiming to raise Indonesia's production outlook by 42% for oil and over 100% for gas by 2030 is a huge challenge. But to do so whilst also achieving emission reduction targets will require huge coordinated effort on behalf of policymakers, regulators and investors. And that's why we're here today, really, to hear from policymakers, regulators, investors on how to achieve the right policy frameworks to achieve these dual goals. Now, to make any successful journey, it's important to understand where you are coming from, where you want to go, but perhaps more importantly, how you want to get there. The right policy will understand the current challenges facing Indonesia's oil and gas sector, have a clear and realistic target on where Indonesia wants to get to, and also lay out a clear path and consistent path of how Indonesia can achieve its production targets in a sustainable manner that aligns with the country's climate goals. So today is all about striking that balance. Thank you. Now, let's move on to the first presenter today. I'd like to introduce and bring in Pak Saleh Abdurrahman from the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources. Pak Saleh, please, if you could proceed and present your case today.
Thank you, Pak Andrew. Thank you for that excellent review of the situation that we face now. I think we happy with the update that you presented. Secondly, I think we would like to appreciate IPA for having this challenging and stimulating discussion. This topic is really timely, in my opinion, and it will support, I guess, to strengthen the regulatory draft that we are now preparing for carbon pricing and climate-friendly industrial development. Can I have my slide, please? Or shall I do it myself?
Yes, we can share your slide, Pak. A minute.
Okay, sorry for that. Share session. Okay, where is it? Is it here? No. Okay. Hello?
Please make it full screen, Pak.
Got it. Thank you. I think you're on mute, back Sally.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, colleagues from IPA attending this webinar. Great to have me this discussion with you on the very interesting topics. Let me start with my first slide to give us a perspective of two different institutions that doing the projection on the net zero emission. If you see here on the left-hand side that IEA, even under the IEA NZE projection, the role of coal, oil, and gas is still there. So it's still like more than 100 extra joule consumption that needed in 2050 under the net zero emission projection. And secondly, if you see on the right-hand side from the IRENA projection on the outlook, we can see here that the projection is more or less similar that what is made by the IEA, that the role of non-renewable is still there on the 2050 trajectory for net zero. Oil and gas and coal is still needed for industry and for transport sector. That's why the first message that we need to give us more confidence of our industry. Secondly, on our Indonesian side, if you see here that on the latest grand strategy for energy plan, we see that the role of oil and gas, especially on the transport sector, is keep continuing from now to 2040. If you see from this slide, and secondly, if we see from the report published by Ministry of the Industry on the demand for gas and coal for the industry is increasing significantly from 2025 to 2035. This is what we can see from the demand side. And then on the bottom side, you can see there the need for the for others for oil and gas for the industrial sectors. So what I'm trying to present in this slide that we still need oil and gas on our national economy, and its role will always will keep increasing at least until 2040, 2050, where we plan to have our Indonesia Maju or Indonesia Emas. That's our vision of our president, where we expect to have the GDP per capita more than $20,000. And for that, I think we need to provide a secure and reliable supply of energy, including oil and gas. That's two slides that give us perspective that these industries are still important in the national economy for a long time to come. Then what about the emission that we resulted from the fossil fuel industry here in Indonesia? You see here that we make an inventory on our emission situation from year 20 to 2019. You see here, most of the emission we get is from the fuel combustion, and very small we got from fugitive oil and gas emission like venting, flaring, as Andrew has made the presentation before. So I think we need to work more on the fuel combustion, especially on electricity and on the downstream side to reduce the emission from the energy sectors. And now the NDC target for Indonesia in 2030, if you see from this slide that we will rely on the increasing share of renewable for our energy mix in 2030. And secondly, we will work on the fuel, on the energy efficiency, as you can see here, from out of the three or nearly 314 million tons, consisting from renewable energy, energy efficiency, and then clean energy, as well as our fuel switching and the land use mine or AVOLU. This is the NDC roadmap for energy sectors. And if you see here on the right hand side how we achieve the target, we're happy to share that very lastly in the last 2 years that we can reach our emission more than what we target. So the realization of emission reduction in Indonesia in the last 2 years is better than what we targeted. Now we move on the National Energy General Plan. This policy, I think, very important for us to give a perspective that when we prepare the RUEN, we already considered the transition. So if you read the RUEN document, at least we have 2 or 3 transition pathways. One is how to shift the use of energy commodities from commodity to national capital. That's the first transition pathway. Secondly, of course, on the energy mix, you can see here that the oil and gas still plays an important role, especially gas. If you see here that minimized oil utilization. Why we minimize oil utilization? This was in the context of reducing import dependency, actually, because when our consuming where our consumption is increasing in the next 20 years, then our production may not be able to keep the consumption. So in order to reduce the import dependency, then we need to shift the use of oil to others in order to keep the production, domestic production meets with the domestic consumption. And then the RUEN also mentioned about optimizing the gas for all use, for industrial use and for other uses. So this is when policy is still valid, is still there, and is still the base for decision making that we make in energy sectors. Now, how to address the issues of like decoupling the economic growth, the oil and gas production with the lowering our emission. I think the deployment of low emission technology is key on oil and gas activities. Nothing we can do to reduce the CO2 emission, but only to reduce the consumption, the production of the combustion. But with using the deployment of low emission, we still can meet both the production increase as well as the emission reduction. And I think I agree with what Andrew has presented on the CCS and CCUS. We have many discussion recently on the promotion of the CCS in ASEAN as well as in Indonesia. And I think many of us already updated with some projects that are now under preparation in Indonesia, and I expected to start injection sometimes in 2026. I think we happy to hear that this schedule is on the scale. This target is on the schedules. Also, I think what we need from transforming the oil and gas industry is to also considering the blue hydrogen. So blue hydrogen is one of the solution that we see can address the existence of oil and of gas industries, at the same time compatible to the 2 degree or 1.5 degrees limit of the Paris Agreement. And another important ways of reducing the emission, of course, by way of energy efficiency in all sectors on energy, on oil and gas activities. If you see here from the IEA net zero emission projection that the role of CCS and CCUS system for the NZE target 2050. What policies that we have developed to promote this greenhouse gas reduction and CCS promotion in the Ministry of Energy? I think we already issued the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources decree in 2019 on emission inventory and mitigation, including inventory on CO2 capture and storage, implementation of CCS technology, as well as on the monitoring, reporting, and verification of carbon reduction. And then we already also established the National Center for Excellence on CCUS. I think many of us are already aware of this from ITB and from Lemigas. And the role of the center is conducting studies on CCS and CCUS storage, source and storage, and how to implement on the more economical ways these technologies. We also strengthen the bilateral and multilateral cooperation on CCS and CCUS. We believe that we have confirmation, if you like, from Japan, for instance, to help us to develop the CCUS technology in Indonesia. We also now preparing the detailed policy on CCS and CCUS implementation. We are preparing the regulation. We also promoting the carbon trading. We just started the launching of the cap and trade voluntary program on electricity sectors, and we soon will see the possibility of deploying this scheme on oil and gas sectors. So what is the key takeaways that I'm trying to make on this presentation? Number one is that we see that oil and gas sector will continue to play its important role on national economic development. So we are optimistic to see these industries to be continuing to develop. And I think the target of 1 million barrel per day and 12 billion cubic feet per day aims to meet domestic demand, reduce import dependency, and enhance energy security. So it has to be continued. But at the same time, oil and gas industries need to implement low emission technology to reduce greenhouse gas emission, as well as we need to explore the possibility or prospect of carbon pricing in Indonesia. With that, Andrew, thank you for your attention, colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pak Sally. If I may just ask one quick follow-up question. You mentioned the implementation or the preparation of the CCUS policy. Is there any update you can provide us on when we might expect to see that policy introduced or ratified?
Thank you, Andre. I think our DG Migas is still preparing the team now. And I think we'll see very soon that we start our meeting. I think we have previously some draft for that regulation supported by ADB, I think, and we may make some adjustment and update it on some issues like you mentioned before, like the MRV issues on the regulation, the leakage, the carbon share from government and the oil and gas industries when they develop the carbon pricing on that CCUS, things like that. So I think we hope that I don't know, but I think this is one of the urgent agenda, and I think we will work very soon on that, Pak Anglo. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for your insights, Saleh. I look forward to discussing this in more detail later on in today's session. Now I'd like to introduce again Ibu Laxmi Duanti from the Ministry of Ministry of Environment and Forestry. Ibu Laxmi, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me now?
We can, yep.
Okay. Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me here for the IPA, the association, for having me here. It is my pleasure to share with you the topic that given to me. Well, related with the topics that we are talking about, it's carbon policies in Indonesia, striking the balance between carbon emission target and the 1 million target. So can you see my slides?
We can.
Okay. Yeah, let me share some slides. I understand that I have, I don't know, it's 10 or 15 minutes, but I'll try my best to share some information. Luckily that Pak Saleh has presented some of the present slide that I would like to explain. So let me now focus on the carbon or the climate mitigations related policies in Indonesia. Yeah, I would like to share some outlook of the Indonesian nationally determined contribution and its implementation strategy and the balance, because yes, today we are going to talk about the balance. Yeah, as a part of the global community and our commitment to the sustainable development, indeed, Indonesia has been actively participate in various multilateral environmental agreements. UNFCCC, or United Nations Framework on Climate Change, is one of the multilateral environmental agreements that we are parties to the convention. So, yeah, in the beginning of the Paris Agreement back in 2015 in Paris, the president has committed Indonesia to be part of the global actions in combating or reducing the greenhouse gas emission levels in the atmospheres. And we right away signed the convention, and the 2016 we ratified the Paris Agreement. So we adopt the Paris Agreement into our national regulations. So as the implementation, one of the implementations of the ratification, we already submit our first NDC at the end of 2016. So we already set our target, the 26% unconditional target, and up to 41% against the business as usual scenario as a conditional target for 2030. So following, now we are in the 2021, we already submit our updated NDCs as well as long-term strategies and low carbon climate resilience 2015 documents into to the UNFCCC Secretariat. So this is the our first NDC, Indonesia. So as I hope all colleagues already aware that we focus into 5 main sectors in our first NDC: energy, waste, IPPU, industrial process and product use, agriculture, and forestry. So among 5 sectors, forestry and energy are expecting to contribute larger portions of the greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So for the countermeasure 1 or the unconditional target, the energy will contribute a very significant percentage. It's about 11, and the forestry will contribute 17%. We have already the NDC strategy. And for each individual sector, we already have the strategy as well as the NDC mitigations roadmap. So we already have a list of main actions, mitigation action for each individual sectors to be able to achieve the NDC target. So of course, each individual sector will then elaborate the climate mitigation actions into their sectors, into their subsector, and develop their own strategy to achieve those targets within the sector. So if you can see here for the energy, I believe Pak Saleh already mentioned and already explains most of the information, but I just would like to share with you that we also put the mentioned actions by Pak Saleh into the NDC strategy. Well, in fact, the NDC and NDC strategy has been developed together between the Ministry of Environment and Forestry as the national focal point for UNFCCC in Indonesia with other related sectors. So this is the baseline and the greenhouse gas emissions reductions target for energy. For the detail, Pak Saleh already mentioned. So as I mentioned, each individual sector may have their own strategy timeline to achieve the greenhouse gas emission reduction target within their sector. I just would like to skip 2 of my slides. I believe I don't need to explain this, the projections, energy supply, energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, as well as this slide. But I just would like to share that we are in developing the NDC and the implementation of NDC, as well as the NDC mitigations roadmap. We are considering many aspects, assumption from the sectors itself. This is the NDC target in 2030. Pak Saleh already also have a similar slide in his presentations. As the national focal point for the climate change action in Indonesia, of course, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry is developing various supports, modalities, including system, the inventories greenhouse gas emission system, the national registry system, to ensure that the set target will be achieved and will be able to be measured at the end of the NDC's period of time. Again, just to show you that this is the figure that we would like to achieve, I will skip this slide as well. So I just need to focus with this and the last part of my presentations. So this is the NDC Implementation Strategy. So we do have the documents, and within the documents, it's already explained and described the ownership and the commitment, how we would like to build the capacity, how we would like to enhance the enabling environment, the communications and network strategy, the function and the role of one greenhouse gas data policy, intervention of activities and plan programs, guideline for implementation and monitoring and reviews. So every sectors within the NDC will have this kind of implementation strategy. Of course, the detail and the focus and the timeline is slightly different from one sector to another. It's really depend on the sectoral policies and action for strategy. This slide is only to detailing the previous one. So as you can see from this slide, we are preparing the guidelines. We are preparing the systems. We are hold the coordination and communications, meetings, etc., to ensure that every sectors will be synergy with the NDC target. So if you're talking about the balance, so respond to the balance between the emission target and the production target. If I would like to say a bit on this, if you can see here, on the energy supply, oil and gas refinery and fugitive emission has not yet included in the greenhouse gas inventory and mitigation scenario due to the lack of data. But it has been included into the plan of improvement because we are adopting the continuous improvement principle. So from time to time, we are improving our data availability. We are improving our method for monitoring and reviews to be able to ensure that the NDC will be able to co-op with the progress or with the updated real conditions. As for the target, well, we understand that it's designed with the zero routine flaring, the CCS, CCUS, the energy efficiency in various stage in drilling, in processing, and that kind of things. So all these actions and strategy, it has been identified to enhance ambition of greenhouse gas emission reductions. Now let me share you with this. As we already aware that the NDC target is up to 2030. The Paris Agreement itself will be continued to serve as the convention under the UNFCCC up to 2050. So every single parties, it's encouraged to formulate and to disseminate their formulation on the long-term strategy and low-carbon climate resilience 2050. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, Indonesia has formulated its LTS LCCR 2050, and it has and the document has been submitted to the UNFCCC Secretariat. So within the documents, we put the longer-term vision than the NDC into this document. So we would like to aligning the climate goals and target with national, subnational, and international objectives, including the SDGs target. We also would like to enhance and to improve and to further encourage the NPS. NPS is the non-party stakeholders. Well, I think I need to share small information. In the Paris Agreement, the target of the NDC it will be a jointly effort between party stakeholders, which is the central government, and the non-party stakeholders. The non-party stakeholders include local government, private businesses, local communities, NGOs, individuals, academia. So we are in this document, we are trying to enabling the non-party stakeholders to be able to further contribute to the targets in the long term. For mitigation, as we are now focusing on mitigations, but I would like to share with you that Indonesia put adaptation as equal important as mitigations. So throughout all the documents in the NDC, in the updated NDC, in the LTS, LCCR documents, Indonesia has put adaptation as equally important than mitigation. So today we are going to focus on the mitigation. So in the mitigation, in the long-term visions, we are preparing the 3 pathway or scenario for the 5 sector categories or sector NDC. So there are 3 scenarios, the current policy scenario, the CPOS, and we also have the scenario for the transition, and we have the scenario for a low carbon scenario compatible with the Paris Agreement. So Indonesia commitment is toward the LCCP. So we will ensure that our scenario will be compatible with the Paris Agreement. So as you may already aware, Paris Agreement is trying to ensure that the increased global temperature will not above 2 degrees Celsius. And even more, based on the IPCC report, the special IPCC report back in 2018, we would ensure and further strengthen our effort in ensuring that the increasing global temperature will not exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this is the main mitigation action when we're talking about the long-term strategy. Of course, the long-term strategy, it's not yet a commitment. It's a formulation to be disseminated, to be communicate with various stakeholders, with other parties. But Indonesia is very serious in preparing this document, and even more, we are not only preparing the document, we are having the scenario and we are preparing the actions to be able to achieve the target. For example, in the forest sector, the platform or the corridors to achieve the long-term strategy is with ensuring that net sink in 2030. So for the forestry sector, Indonesia will achieve the condition of net sink in 2030 with various action. We reduce deforestation, so further reduce deforestation. In fact, within these last 5 years, we already reduced the deforestation rate very significant. We will increase and enhance the sustainable forest management, peatland and mangrove restorations, afforestations, and other actions. As for energy, I believe Pak Saleh already mentioned numbers of the actions, but in the long-term strategy, the energy sector will focus on renewable energy, the hydrogen and CCUS, and other, as well as for other sectors. So we already have the main mitigation action to achieve the long-term strategy. So this is the detail of the long-term strategy. The name of the document is Long-Term Strategy for Low Carbon and Climate Resilience 2050. Every single parties will have this document, 2050. Why 2050? I already mentioned because the Paris Agreement will serve as the convention under the UNFCCC until 2050. So within the Indonesia documents, we predict that if we could ensure all the main activities and main actions and all the assumption will be fulfilled according to the documents, according to modeling, and we expect to reach the net zero emissions in 2060 or sooner. So I think that's all that I would like to share with you today. Again, thank you very much for having me. Hope that the information that I just shared will be benefit for us. Thank you very much, and back to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Ibu Laxmi. Really interesting sort of insight into the global climate plans or targets that Indonesia is contributing to. I just had one quick question around your sort of the target scenario, the LCCP. I just kind of wondering what does that mean for the energy sector in your mind? What does that mean for the outlook for the oil and gas sector?
Yeah, well, it's not only for the energy, but for all the 5 sectors. We need to be more ambitious, and we need to be more, innovative in the policy and the strategy of the policy itself. We need further, to develop more technology needed. Of course, we need to ensure that resource mobilizations will be there, especially the financial and the investment, because to be able to have or to ensure that the all mitigation actions within the LTS document will be implemented, we need the resources. So I think that's my quick response, Andrew.
Great. Perhaps we can dig a little bit more into the sort of policy making or the future policy setting to support those targets in the discussion later on. Fantastic. Okay, thanks very much, Ibu Laxmi. Now we will move on to the presentation by Ibu Mayasita from the Ministry of Finance. Please carry on.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me start screen sharing. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm summoned to explain this in 15 minutes. I hope I can get through that. Andrew, but you're over time as well.
Yeah, my bad.
Okay. No, I'll do my best. So these are the outline that I will discuss today. So basically, transition towards a green transition and climate finance and sustainable financing development. And also, I will talk a little bit about our plan on developing a carbon market and carbon pricing mechanism within Indonesia. As the Ministry of Finance, we always start with the picture that the economy is having a difficult time right now. As you know, that Indonesia and all other countries globally is facing a pressure in the fiscal side, creating a widening fiscal deficit in order to deal with the pandemic. In the short run, of course, all government in the world will focus on the pandemic dealing or handling. In the short run, more access to equal vaccine will be the priority of the government, and also creating stimulus for low middle income, especially the lower income that's affected by the pandemic. But also in the medium to long term, we also would like to continue with reforms, not just for inequality and poverty and improvement in the value added of the economy, but also on sustainable development and environment, including climate actions. There's a lot of challenge ahead, right? Especially after the pandemic, but this is also happening even before the pandemic. So strengthening the fiscal reform agenda and fiscal consolidation will be key to the fiscal sustainability. We would like to aim for optimal mobilization of non-state budget climate change funding sources, ensuring a recovery and transition to a greener economy. But the key word is the transition needs to be just and affordable. Otherwise, it's hard to get the political support to do it. Strengthen the viability of green projects so that they can be financed by the financial sectors and only supported a little bit by the fiscal side if needed. And the current market mechanism has not actually able to reflect the price difference. So and also currently there's also a limitation in the green financing, which is why this is the one thing that the Ministry of Finance is currently working on. On the green transition, Ibu Laksmi has already explained this. Basically, we have the nationally determined contribution. The detailed plan has been explained, but what we want to say is now we have through national effort only 29%, and we're still catching up with that from the financing side, and 41% with international support. So these have been explained by Ibu Laksmi, but I would like to point out that there's a lot that has been done. Yeah, in terms of preparing the scene, the political and policy scene for making this target implementable. So fiscal policy response to climate change issues range from mitigation, fiscal framework, different tax incentive, revocation of fuel subsidy. We also have implement climate budget tagging. Indonesia from the financing side also have a green bond, green sukuk that supported green projects. Mainstreaming climate budget tagging in local government budget, around almost 20 sub-regional have already included in this first round, and we would like to expand to more. And we also have ecological-based fiscal transfer. So transfer to region is also, you put some KPI on ecology for getting more transfer. So from the fiscal side point of view, the ratification of the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, and this other stuff, which was also written in the NDC and RPJMN, is also, we have a implementation from the fiscal policy point of view, as I mentioned in this slide. So from our side, Ibu Laksmi explained how we're going to achieve the 29% with the end of 41%. And then I would like to emphasize here how we will finance this transition, right? So for the target of 29%, if we're looking at the number of the public money that's available between 2020 to 2030, it only covers around 27%. And with private that we currently have, we still have a gap of 40%. So 27% from the public money, private 32%, and still have a gap around 40% to achieve the 29 NDC target. And for the 41, the gap is a bit wider, but this also is assuming that we get international support. Just an affordable transition is very important in thinking about climate action, because otherwise we can only have targets, but will be very hard to implement. So source of financing are various, yeah. Now we have state budget, non-state budget, and also from the international side, we have bilateral and multilateral. The important part of the whole financing and effort into a just and affordable transition is also private investment, right? So the state budget is supposed to be only play the role as catalytic impact, yeah, for financing to invite more private investment into the green project towards a better transition. From the state budget side, yeah, we see that from the fiscal policy, we have a tax and excise facility to support renewable energy and clean technology. We have climate mitigation and adaptation budget. We implement the budget tagging, as I mentioned, to really follow where the money goes. Because, when you say you want to prioritize on a certain things, you have to show it also in the budget and in the implementation of the policy. And then we have fiscal transfer to subnational and village fund that I mentioned that are tied into some ecological KPIs. And we also have innovative financing for sustainable development. It's including strengthening green infrastructure financing, deepening the Islamic financial market through our green sukuk, and also preparation of SDG government security framework to strengthen the achievement of the SDG target. Tax policy, I will give my presentation later, but this slide is only showing a myriad of different instruments that has been provided, especially here to encourage new renewable energy, geothermal in this case, and reducing motor vehicle CO2 emission. State expenditure. So the first part is the fiscal policy coming from the revenue side. Yeah. Now we also have expenditure side policy that also supporting the climate change or climate action movement. From the expenditure policy, alokasi anggaran for mitigation and adaptation are laid out in the chart on the right-hand side. So you can see that a big part is still in the blue line, which is mitigation, and 30% are on the adaptation. Composition of the climate change mitigation budget by sectors also varies, but the biggest is going to energy and transportation, almost 84%. And by type of output, composition of climate change budget by type of output, if you divide output into infra and non-infra, then infrastructure is still account for 88% of the overall pie of the budget. Of course, this needs to improve, and we would like to see more, private investment, and also we have to work together to create supporting environment so all of this type of financing can flourish so we can really achieve the target affordably. For the financing side, this is green sukuk. So Indonesia green sukuk is quite successful. Although if you would like to be honest on this, there's no benefit of having green sukuk versus non-green sukuk nowadays. The yield and the price is similar to the brown or the regular bonds. Then that's also happen only for the sovereign, but also for corporate bonds. So we currently globally, this is not Indonesia's issue. Globally, we don't see the benefit of having a green bonds versus a brown bonds. This is something that we together as the global community need to address in the future. Otherwise, there's no incentive other than, we're aiming for achieving the zero emission, for example. There's no financial incentive for countries, corporation, or sovereign to have green bonds vis-a-vis the regular one. Next is, from the financing side, we also have a form of blended financing. We have SDG 1 Indonesia managed by one of our SOE, it's PT SME, and also we created Public Service Agency, BPDLH, it's Indonesia Environment Fund to manage the other type of funds. We're also planning to create a carbon exchange in Indonesia after we create the trading and exchange mechanism with the new presidential decree is currently still under discussion. So for the Indonesia, the BPDLH, the Indonesia Environmental Fund, there's several roles, but basically it's helping the climate change control. And then it's working with the RED Plus program and framework in different area, forest, conservation, social forestry, etc. All right. Oh, hold on. Okay, so this is the GCF. GCF is actually an implementing entity for the UNFCCC and was established during COP back in 2010. Indonesia have 3 lines of projects. First is the Readiness Program 1 and 2. This is currently ongoing. Yeah, GCF financing amount to 100 million and co-financing more than that. So this is really the catalytic financing impact that I mentioned before. And then the second project is project preparation for bus rapid transit in Semarang. This is done by PT SMI. Yeah, this is the GCF funding is 100 million and the co-financing is sevenfold, 721 million. And then the last is the UNDP, result-based payment, RBP, and RED Plus, the period of the project between 2014 and 2016. For the carbon pricing policy, this is where it gets interesting. So the aim is basically to reduce national greenhouse emission. It becomes policy intervention to overcome market failure. So the practice is what we plan to do is polluters pay principle. Yeah, it will encourage businesses to lower their emission. This can also be an alternative source for additional financing for this type of program. And also currently government is preparing, as I mentioned, the regulation for carbon pricing. We work closely with Ibu Laksmi and LHK. Implementation of international carbon trading will consider the discussion during Article 6 of Paris Agreement at COP26 this year. So there's basically two instruments for carbon pricing. The first is the trading instrument. The second is the non-trade instrument. The trading instrument, we have two types, basically. We have the emission trading system, ETS. This is one entity that emits more can buy permit from another entity that emits less using a cap and trade system. Second is the emission offset or crediting mechanism. In here, entities undertaking emission reduction activities that can sell carbon credit to entities requiring carbon credit. So it's basically similar, but it's just the provision of the emission permit at the beginning that makes between the two systems different, but this both will be under the new regulation. Non-trade instruments include carbon tax imposed on carbon content or carbon emitting activity, and also on result-based payment. On this part, Indonesia has already a lot going on. So Indonesia in the global context, if you can see that green is already having ETS implemented or scheduled, yeah. The solid green is China, Australia, yeah, a few in the Europe, but not many. Indonesia is including in the yellow, the solid yellow with Brazil and other countries. It's ETS and carbon tax under consideration. Because we really aim to have this considered and hopefully can be implemented to help us to reduce the emission in Indonesia. Sustainable financing. So, I mean, Indonesia will hold the G20 presidency in 2020, right? And as part of that, of course, as also part of the SFWG and the Troika for that presidency, Indonesia is part of the Troika with Italy now, and also actively involved in the Sustainable Finance Working Group. So for this, they are creating a roadmap on sustainable finance and in the synthesis report, but basically, if you look at globally, the climate bonds initiative, there's already an increase in the amount of climate bonds, even though, as I mentioned, there's no benefit whatsoever in terms of the pricing and the yield. But we can see that the demand for this type of financing has already increased. ASEAN also started to develop the Asean Taxonomy. For this, why taxonomy and measurement is key is that because once carbon is globally traded, yeah, now the carbon market is more fragmented, right? Once it's globally traded, then taxonomy and measurement and how each country measure, etc., will be an important part of creating a liquid market of carbon. Last but not least, OJK also have a roadmap for sustainable finance. We have delivered the roadmap number 1, which ended in 2019, creating policy and regulation and awareness on different segment of the sustainable finance. But we also now starting the phase 2 between 2021 to 2025 to strengthen the sustainable financing more. This will involve a lot of the new things that are discussed also globally, the cross-border adjustment, the taxonomy, the measurement, etc. In order to create the right market infrastructure and also protecting the Indonesian market. As you already know, because carbon is more of a buyer's market, buyers are more aware. In the buyer's market scenario, price is always pressure down, right? Which you can see the price of carbon has went down quite significantly since the global community first started many years ago. Yeah, so this has to be like a global setup to protect the pricing so that we have the needed investment in order to do the transition. I think that's all for me. I will skip this 2 parts and I would be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ibu Masita. I guess one quick question for me, and I thank everyone so far for sticking to their time. We are running a little bit over, but I think that's basically because of my presentation. One quick question from me then would be, you mentioned the carbon pricing policy that Indonesia is considering and looking to implement. Can you give a timeline on when we might expect to see some more announcements on that, and perhaps is there anything you can say on what direction the policy is likely to go in?
So we have to set up the regulation, yeah. So the government is currently working on the presidential decree. It's near finalization, and after the presidential decree, then we can start with the implementing regulation. What I just explained before is the setup what we have put in our mind when we do the draft presidential decree, that we would like to create a carbon market domestically that has 2 sides, yeah, demand side and supply side, and we will have not just the trading mechanism, but also we will also have a carbon tax.
And this policy would not be exclusively for oil and gas. Obviously, it would cover all sort of major
this
emission.
Is for the economy, yeah, for the whole
sectors.
economy, yeah.
Yep, understood. Great. Well, let's talk a little bit more about some of the points you raised during your presentation later on in the discussion. But we've heard a lot around Indonesia's sort of climate targets and a lot around some of the fiscal policy and fiscal targets that are on the way. But it'd be great to hear now from Fatar from SKK Migas on the production targets, which again is a key part of the discussion today. So over to you, Pak Fatar.
Thank you, Andrew. Very good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I see here over 340 participants. Well, thank you to bring me in this particular event. It's very important for us. I'm going to talk about the upstream activities regarding how are we going to cope with the carbon policy. Very important for our future sustainability of the environmental target. I'm going to start with what is our energy mix in the future. It's been presented by previous speakers, but I'm going to repeat this. Very important. The next slide is, we are talking about, next slide, okay. As mentioned before, this is the energy mix. Looking at the target until 2050. If you're looking at the percentage itself, basically the oil and gas, the fossil fuel, the percentage tend to decrease 2030 and 2050. However, decreasing in the percentage doesn't mean that decreasing in the volume, but the volume is still there. What does it mean? You're looking at the oil demand. Yeah, by 2030, basically the oil demand will be over 2 million barrels a day, while our target is still 1 million, still less than half of the demand in 2030. So what it means to us, we need to have a very, very strong vision in order to accommodate our needs in the future. But still, we cannot be a great producer and ready to export, but we still have to fulfill our domestic demand in the future. So quite aggressive. We still need to produce oil as well as gas. Next slide. I'm going to show you the history of our productions. The last 40 years, you're looking at here, the production between oil and gas quite stable, also up and down. This is due to the oil price is also not stable. That created the uncertainty of investment. But still, we're trying to maintain the flat production. Our peak production was back in mid-90s, but then tend to decline until today because there is no giant discovery either for oil as well for gas. So that's why SKK Migas is trying to make a long-term plan for all the industry, especially for oil and gas industry, to be able to deliver the next 10 years. The target is not that really aggressive, actually. It's 1 million as compared to when we developed this 800,000 barrel a day. It's 200,000 increasing, but it's not really easy. And today we got another pressure also from the environmental as well as the energy transition itself. Are we going to survive? Of course. Looking at the previous slide, basically we still need to produce, so we have to survive. Yeah. So what we do in order to achieve our target in the long-term plan by 2030, 1 million barrel oil a day and 12 billion scf gas per day, which is double than today production. With that production of gas, of course, is going to increase twice of the impurities as well as CO2 emission to the environment. That's really, really a very challenging task for everybody, especially for upstream oil and gas industry. Next slide. This is what we do. When we know that the production is really a priority for Indonesia, rather than we have a more import either refined fuel or crude oil in the future, so we need to make sure that we can boost our productions. So clear vision, we deploy, talk to the oil and gas companies. Although this is really a very tough target, but we're trying to align each other, in order to achieve that target. Secondly, we need to build within our organization, not only SKK Migas, but as well as our oil company, the strong, capable people. Organization, what we call center of excellence. Everybody, they can, not only just talking about the conventional and also the traditional way of thinking, but they have to have a very good knowledge, good ground for the future requirement, especially for the technology required for the next decades. And then we built the one-door service policy in order to make sure all the permitting requirement, the environmental regulation requirement that we have to put together, the process of getting this done very quickly. So the oil producer, they can invest and implement as soon as possible. The other more important aspect is the commercialization. This carbon decarbonization policy in the future, of course, will impact the commercialization of, especially for the gas, will not be competitive if you are not doing this production in a green manner. So that's why a number of our POD, Plan of Development, right now, working under the commercialization. We are dealing with this aspect to be more competitive. The requirement of the environmental are already taken into consideration in the POD and commercial. Last but not least is digitalization. We need to have a control, how we can monitor the CO2 emissions in the future. Not to mention the policy will be put in place hopefully very soon. Then we know what will be the carbon pricing policy that we can utilize for controlling all this, trading between the emission and as well as the way we're trying to eliminate the CO2. So these 5 elements is very, very important for SKK Migas in order to really build, the same alignment with the requirement for the future. Next slide. So here's what we do. We build a house in SKK Migas. We have 10 pillars plus enablers. The top ambition and target is, one of them is sustainable environment. Of course, we have to consider all this need for the future development, especially for development of the new discovered hydrocarbon. How are we going to bring the molecule from the ground in the green technology? Yeah, we build the national capabilities as well as best production. So the question is how we strike the balance, bringing the production 1 million barrels, 12 BCF a day, and to cope with the requirement of the decarbonization policy. In this particular strategic plan that we put together, this will be for the long term. With the key programs that we have, 18 plus target that we have, we incorporate all this aspect into our program. When we discuss with the oil and gas companies, of course, all of this aspect need to be put into consideration, whether this is environmental requirement, the economic value of the asset as well. So this is really important. Everybody, especially in SKK Migas organization, to have an alignment how we're trying to achieve our goals. Next slide. So here's the story. How we can build this production in the next 10 years, even until 2039. Quite aggressive. Right now we have the current production. We're optimizing the existing asset. That's on the light green. The production declining, but we need to ensure that the resource to production to be in place, as well as EOR, enhanced oil recovery, chemical EOR, water flood, including the exploration activities. You're looking at the full cycle. All will link. All we have the activities related to carbon emissions. Similarly, we apply for the gas. In 2030, we're going to reach 12 BCF per day production, which is double than today. Yeah. So this will be in all picture. You see in the opening video by IPA, actually already we have an alignment with all the oil companies in order to deliver this production. Now the challenge between now and then is the implementation of CO2 reduction. Next slide. I'm going to give an overview a bit on the upstream oil and gas. Maybe some of you may be already aware of this. The source of the emission, number one, coming from the production facilities. We have the combustion and turbine, the boiler, generator that will emit the environment. We have the transportation associated with all our operations, like cars, trucks, ships, choppers. More importantly, the big contribution of the CO2 is coming from the ground. Some of the field here on the right side here, on the bottom part, you can see a number of fields that consist of maybe an average like 20 to 30% of CO2 from the ground itself. What we do now is we separate and we just disperse this into environment. This will become a requirement to capture this in the future. So these are the example of big productions coming from, like, East Natuna, Jambarang Tium Biru, not to mention later maybe from Repsol, Saka Kemang also will have the CO2 composition there that will need to be treated for the future. The challenge is we have 60% mature field, lead field life, that dealt with very high costs. Of course, if you're going to fix this, this is a challenge for the mature field. That will impact the economics. How are we going to cope with this? It's something that we have to, to take that in our discussion. Like today, you see the Ministry of Environment as well as the Ministry of Finance. They are trying to sit down and put together the policy for carbon pricing, which is very important for the upstream activities in the future. Yeah. Next slide. Very quick. What we do today, we don't have a big framework of policy or umbrella as yet, which is still under the development. So we just utilizing whatever policy that we have. Right now, we follow the commitment to Paris Agreement. We have the zero flaring target by Minister of Energy Resources. We have the proper, which is environmental rating system regulation. We use that. The energy management regulation, as well as our SKK Migas guideline under the HSC requirement. Okay, those are the only policy that we have. This will need to be, expanded with the big umbrella policy. How we can link this into the carbon pricing itself. When the oil company get the discovery, proposing the plan of development, how can we make sure that this project will fly? That's the issue. Can we do it? Of course, we have to do it. Otherwise, it will stay in the ground. Not only that, we cover it now. The marginal field, without talking about the CO2 emission, we already accommodate some of the incentive for them in order to make sure that we have the value of the asset and we can unlock all the potential. If we have a huge resource like Marcela, for example, they need the carbon capture. Of course, we have to accommodate as well. This is a big resource that we have, So the only instrument that we have right now is under the upstream policy, under the PSC, plus under the regulation of the Minister of Finance, the tax, DMO, things like that we can cover in order to ensure that the requirement for the CCUS or CCS, can be captured in the project. The reforestation that's been in place, the energy management, some of them been in place. This is only small contribution. The big contribution will be carbon capture, utilization, and storage. That's a big chunk of the project. This also the utilization not only for keeping, not only the storage, but utilization for the EOR, enhanced oil recovery. We use the CO2 flooding system in the future. Wherever we have the reservoir that needs the CO2 flooding, very close to the area that we can produce more CO2, there will be, in terms of the economic scale, will be justified for us to be integrated all together. Otherwise, we have to do something else to transport this into the area. All of this economic aspect, of course, need to be put together and run and look at by all parties. Do we need to continue or not? If we don't continue, striking the balance will not happen, right? For sure, I think we got the very strong support, not only in SK Migas as well as the other minister. I think in order for us to produce more hydrocarbon for the future needs. Next, I'm going to run through very quickly some example, the reduction. These are some of the regulation we have. The flaring, capturing the flaring. Unfortunately, we already have the policy to sell our flare gas. Nobody interested. That's a problem. The price is low, But when it comes to that investment, it's very high, and they cannot sell the gas. Commercialization is also become an issue. So that's flaring also. Maybe for the future, we need to redesign our facilities with a good technology, how we can, recycle this back into the productions. There is a few of initiative been put together under Pertamina and some other field, to recycle all this flare gas. So the zero flare policy is there, as well as the quality standard for emission. That's the only action plan that we can put. You mentioned about LCPP. That's what we have. But for the future project, of course, we need to handle the the complexity of the project itself into the design. Of course, the impact will be the cost. Next slide. Here's the actually the requirement of the PSC. I'm gonna show you what is the requirement of the PSC Section 5, Article 5.2.4 related to environmental. Responsible for implementing HSC standard is under the oil and gas. Comply and implement LHC regulation also there. To implement and be responsible to have all PSC term and measure sustainable HSC program improvement. All of these aspects already put in there. There is a requirement. With that, of course, the government need to ensure themselves we can help the industry, to proceed with their plan. Yeah, with this requirement, we're going to utilize this reference for the oil companies to proceed with their plan in order to, to make the economic of the project is flying. Okay. Next slide. This is just a very quick view. The next slide is only just, the mechanism, how we assess this using the life cycle assessment. This is just all the theoretical based on the proper. So we have the proper rating beyond the compliance. Some of them, they can do this, but it's still not maximized yet. We still need to do more. Next slide. So here's to give you an overview, the full cycle of the activities. Exploration, 3 to 6 years. The appraisal of the seismic, 1 or 2 years, and drilling. The development, 3 to 6 years. Production is only 10, 20 years of the 30 years of the PSC contract. And then we have to abandon. So all this cycle actually covered by the environmental requirements. The environmental baseline assessment, AMDAL is the environmental impact assessment. There could be a requirement for the future. Whenever you submit the environmental impact assessment, the requirement will be the CO2 reduction. That's really easy for us. If there is a requirement by KLHK, for SK Chemicals, it's easy. Okay, this is a need. So we have to comply with this. Let's do it. What will be the cost impact? We have some instruments to handle that. We have the split. We have the the tax. We have the depreciation timeline. So those are the things that we can utilize in order to increase the economic of the project. And the productions, that's the challenge today. The existing productions. If the production still, let's say for another 5 or 10 years, while the implementation CO2 reduction is really urgent, we need to step back, have a look at. Their economic is very difficult already. Some Pertamina feel, even today, to unlock the potential, they need some incentive. Not to mention the requirement for CO2 reduction. So again, I think the topic today is very, very challenging. Can we strike the balance? So again, with the existing marginal, the remaining reserve, the field being headed over to Pertamina, that's quite challenging. But of course, there is no way we can just leave it by themselves, but we have to do it, as much as we can to make sure that happens. Yeah. Next slide. These are the energy managements. I think the solar panel, some of them already installed. The green building operations, this only just a short-term plan that we do. Not a big contribution for the greenhouse gas emission requirement for the future, especially the need for 2050. Yeah. So we need to start from now. What we do, we will be sitting together with the Minister of Energy Resources to develop a framework and align with the other ministerial office like KLHK, Environmental Office, as well as the Finance. So we can integrate all this policy together. It's easily for the investor whenever they have to continue with the development of the new field, or including the improvement of the existing field. Otherwise, we have to stop our production. We don't want to do that. Next, quick. These are some example field that we use: renewable energy, solar panel, in Oyong water, wellhead platform modification. Next, associated gas use. Right now, we are trying to utilize this as the leaf, the gas leaf. But again, if you use as a fuel, still you are emitting the CO2. So things that we need to really, consider in the future, what would be the best technology to deal with the associated gas. Now, a huge amount of associated gas available in the, especially for the oil field, especially for the gas solution drive or gas gap drive reservoir. Next. There's also some other initiative in Pertamina. The flare, they reuse. Premier Oil also, they reuse it. Not really big. The project cost is only, $300,000 US, but they will improve the revenue. Yeah. Small things, but big value for the whole. Next. This is another example in the Saffron. Yeah. We're collecting the vapor from the tank back and putting into as a condensate. That's something that we can also minimize, but still have the venting right there. Something that maybe if you want to have a zero venting, there's another technology need to be implemented, and another cost will be involved. Okay, next. So these are number of CCUS projects underway. We have Gundi project in the Pertamina Asset 4 in the Central East Java. Yeah, so we're going to utilize this CO2, and then this will be this is we are inject into the reservoir. The challenge is whether the reservoir will be intact to keep the CO2 inside the reservoir, no leaking. What technology? How much cost for the well? So that's being discussed. Of course, there will be a number of costs involved in this particular area. For feel like Gundi is marginal already, and you invest more, of course, it's going to ruin their economy. Yeah, so maybe Pertamina someday will come to see us and have a look at how we can put this on the table and make sure that this will happen. Next, another project in the Saka Kemang. Greg will talk about it. That's something that probably we need to put it in the reservoir. But looking for the good integrity reservoir is not easy. You have to do the test, ensure there is no leaking from reservoir to the atmosphere. Otherwise, we're going to be the same. Next project, the EOR project ongoing with Chupu. This is the CO2 injection. The JTP project, they will have a huge amount of CO2 productions, 30% out of 300 million scarf a day of gas will be injected and to enhance the recovery of oil in the Sukawati. Next project. We are working with the BP right now. EGR is the enhanced gas recovery. So they're trying to produce more, but CO2 will be delivered to the atmosphere, but we inject to the field. That will increase also the productions by having the pressure maintenance and the reservoir. Okay, next. Okay, the challenging situation that we face right now. So we need to have this, of course, relative large investment cost. There is no incentive yet. That's why we need to have this carbon pricing policy put in place. In the remote area, something we have to do, and also the technology that we need. Yeah? And of course, we need to have abundant domestic gas absorption and utilization. That means, can we use this CO2 for EOR or do something else? Otherwise, we have to do a storage, keep in the storage. So these are the 5 challenging situations that we are facing. But I believe with the center of excellence that we have, people in the oil and gas companies, the SKK Migas, and also the Ministerial Office Energy and Mineral Resources, we can sit down and we sort it out to comply with the Paris Agreement. Okay, so I think that's all I have, Andrew. Happy to take any questions in the next session. Back to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Fathar. I think in the interest of staying on time, we'll jump over sort of questions directly on your presentation just now, and we'll definitely hit you up in the discussion section of today. But I'd like to just move on, just to bring us back on track, move on to Pat Gregg from Repsol. Really interested to hear the sort of perspective from an investor in Indonesia, and also a company sort of at the forefront, I guess, of the development of CCS projects and frameworks in Indonesia. So I'll hand it over to Pat Gregg. You're on mute, Greg, if you could just unmute yourself.
You know, it's not a conference unless someone's been on mute.
Exactly.
Well, it's obviously a terrific pleasure and opportunities to speak in front of all our friends at the IPA and this distinguished panel. I will catch us up a little bit on time, I suspect, because a number of the key points have been made, and I'm going to draw them out as we go through. So, you know, for those of you who don't know who Repsol is, we are more than just the motorcycle racing team we do with Honda in Indonesia that's so popular. We're an integrated energy company. We're headquartered in Madrid, Spain, which means that we have a very active upstream. We have midstream, and we refine and create energy products as well. In Indonesia, we've been very active for a number of years, and I'll touch on that in a second. But importantly, you know, Indonesia is part of Repsol's plans for the future, as we announced in our strategic plan at the end of last year. And we've also made a commitment to net zero emissions, and we were right at the very forefront of doing that, which is starting to shape our portfolio, as we touched on earlier. So within Indonesia, you know, we're famous for the picture at the bottom, which is the discovery we made in 2019 together with our partners Petronas and Moeco at the Sakakemang field in South Sumatra. So that was super exciting. But preceding that, you know, we've been very active. We had to shoot seismic over that block. We've been doing a very, very large seismic offshore in Andaman 3. We've had other wells that led up to that success. So, you know, we've really been committed to exploring in Indonesia, and, you know, we've seen some results from that, which is very, very encouraging. So, you know, energy transition means different things to different people. I mean, it's worth noting that the IPA did not have a committee for energy transition a year ago. You know, so even as the group of companies that are committed to investment in Indonesia, which run the gamut of, you know, large IOCs to smaller companies, you know, we all collaborate in the IPA to try and meet the needs of the industry, and you know, this is something that just is new to us as well. And your first slide but Andrew talked very succinctly about how amazingly quick the transition has in fact come upon us. I wouldn't say it surprised everyone, but I would be among those it did surprise in its speed. And of course, now everybody's, and I guess I'm targeting this as perhaps the larger international companies, but I know companies that operate domestically are focused on this too, are looking not just at the classic things that have dictated where companies choose to deploy their capital. And I've listed, on the slide, you can see, the portfolio decisions have always been about where to put your capital compared to somewhere else. We look at prospectivity, the cost of development, how quickly you can get it out of the ground, the extent to which you actually have to build new infrastructure or there's existing ones, can you access energy markets, the country that you're being hosted by, what is the fiscal regime you're working under and how attractive is it relatively, and how stable is it, and how workable is the regulatory framework. Now, it's worth pointing at this point that Indonesia scores really well on a lot of these metrics. The energy markets are, absolutely huge. There's a lot of existing infrastructure. When you're supported, you can go reasonably quickly. Fatar has already spoken about the improvements to the regulatory framework that have been put in place, and it's a work in progress, but it's progressing well to increase Indonesia's position on that competitiveness when companies are now looking to where they deploy their capital in the upstream versus where they put it into renewables or similar activity. And obviously, Indonesia's improvements to its fiscal terms in the bid round are a good example of this, where it's tweaking that competitiveness using those classic metrics. The interesting part, of course, comes that we've just, instead of having gotten rid of those, which remain completely relevant, we have now just added an extra barrier, an extra hurdle, an extra challenge, which is carbon, and whether or not the project you have has a way of dealing with it, where you rank compared to everywhere in your own company's portfolio and your competitors' portfolio, and where the regulatory frameworks for countries as a whole rank for that. And that all goes into the question that governs where companies are going to be deploying their capital. Where are they going to explore? Where are they going to develop? Taken into the context, obviously, where we started with Pak Saleh saying, completely correctly, that Indonesia oil and gas demand is significant. The production that producing companies put out plays a huge, important role in the economy and meeting the energy requirements of Indonesian society. So, how does that all get mixed together? As Fatar said, where is the balance? And an important note here, and it may not be true for every company, but it's certainly true for our company, that these are not just reputation enhancers. These are strategic decisions that have been talked about at the very top levels of our company about where we prioritize investments, and they're shaping our portfolio. We don't have one internal playbook and an external playbook. It's quite common to hear our leadership say, we will walk the walk on this. We will do what we say, which is very important. So what does that mean translating into, Indonesia, and how do we move forward? I'm not going to talk at great length about the Saki Kemang project. I was gratified to see Fatar's slide about it. but essentially, in order to enable investments like that, we need to have some way of dealing with the carbon we are going to emit in that process. CCS being an obvious one. And every time we speak, incidentally, to the team at ESDM or MIGAS or SKK MIGAS or the Ministry of the Environment, we're always super gratified because we see this being reflected back to industry now, where it's more likely that there'll be a slide talking about sources and places to put carbon come from MIGAS or SKK MIGAS than it is from us putting it forward. I mean, we're hearing some strategic alignment now, which is incredibly encouraging. We've heard about carbon pricing and trading, emissions reduction initiatives, nature-based solutions. These are the sorts of things we need that will allow investments to be made in a meaningful way in the time frame they've got. Now, the last couple of points are where this becomes more difficult, and obviously we'll have the presidential regulation, and then we'll have the implementing regulations that fall out of it. But remember, we also work under a PSC. Cost recovery is a key feature. So, imagine one of the projects we just saw where there's an opportunity to reduce flaring, but it doesn't improve production. Can we still make that investment? How is that going to be evaluated? If there isn't a requirement under the environmental legislation, on what basis could the regulator approve it as additional cost without it being measured as a loss to the state? These are obviously very desirable things to start investing in, but there are nuances that need to be implemented in the regulation that would let us tackle it effectively. And as everybody before me has already said, the success in this is going to be key to letting that investment happen, for chasing that 1 million barrels a day, to deploying the capital and resources that are needed to achieve that, from the spectrum of, exploration all the way through to development and EOR. Because Indonesia needs the energy. And we all have a real important role in putting that forward. So that is my presentation, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Greg. I think that gives a good overview of the sort of challenges facing IOCs when they're looking at potentially investing in projects in Indonesia, but also they have an international portfolio, other options. Other options and various pros and cons of allocating capital to other places. Be interested. We've got a bit of time before maybe one question before we jump into more sort of general discussion. I'd be interested to hear your sort of perspective, given Repsol's net zero ambitions, and it should be said that Repsol is sort of in that group of European international oil companies that are sort of charging ahead or forging the way forward from an oil and gas perspective in terms of decarbonisation. How does that really impact your sort of operations on the ground in Indonesia? How do you manage to try to minimise emissions in line with sort of head office targets, but without necessarily the sort of supporting regulation on the ground in Indonesia?
Yeah, it's a tremendous question. The reality is we are trying to shape so that it does our project so that it does meet those requirements. Obviously, the regulations aren't in place yet, but they're progressing. We're very optimistic that we'll end up in the right place at near enough the right time. That will unlock a company like Repsol's ability to invest in these really exciting It was a major discovery. It was a major discovery. We're really excited. We're really excited to develop it. We just need to make sure we can do it on ways that the expectations of stakeholders, not least of which is the Indonesian government and its commitment to Paris.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting just
it's interesting just how things have changed even in the short period since
the Cali
Dalam discovery was made back in, I think, 2019.
That sort of wave of
increasing pressure on the industry to make sure it's producing and developing resources in a sustainable manner. It's quite impressive how quickly that has come across us. It's been amazing, and of course, when we talk about CCS, we have to walk about the mechanism that would let that work. We're engaging a lot of people on this panel as it happens. We've met many of the people talking about this to find an avenue in a way that how we can do it in a way that, as Pat Fatah said, balances the needs.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Well, what I'd like to do now is just open up a discussion amongst the panelists we have on. We can all join back in. I think I do believe Ibu Masita has been called away at the last minute, so unfortunately we won't be able to hear more on the sort of fiscal side of things from the Ministry of Finance. But I think we've still got a good range of people that can comment on some of the key issues. I guess the opening question I'd just like to pose would be, having heard the various viewpoints today, having heard about Indonesia's climate targets, about the sort of investment environment and the work that is being done to improve that, having heard about the production targets as well, I'd be really interested to hear from the panelists, what's the sort of one thing that they see as the biggest challenge or the biggest barrier to Indonesia being able to balance climate goals with its production targets. Maybe I've sprung that upon you without giving you enough time to think about it. But who would like to have a go at answering that question first?
Well, if I may. Pak Fatar, silakan. Sorry, Pak Fatar, silakan.
No, I just said. Give the opportunity to Greg as the producer. The producer. What is your challenge now?
Kasian. No, look, I see a lot of challenges. Principally time. The way we make money, deploying capital is by doing it, finishing, producing. Until we're up in the point where we have regulations that work, to the extent that they are a barrier to investment, it will be to those things happening. From a company point of view, we want to start that process. From an Indonesia point of view, we want to get that energy into cities, people's lives and the economy. So that would probably be my first one. I think that sense of urgency needs to be maintained. I'm always encouraged when I see the presentations like we saw today, where it's like all of those points are, well understood by government, but it's that activity we need to now focus on and deliver so that it unlocks everything.
Yeah, so the pace of development or the pace of change can never be fast enough, unfortunately. But we must keep trying.
Okay, let me add to Greg here. The investor right now is not only looking for the fossil fuel industry. They're trying to shift to another energy. That's why they would call it the energy transition. That's the pressure we got in the upstream. So what do you want to do is basically how do we want to maintain the attractiveness of the investments in the country? Ensure that we are okay, we want to invest, developing this oil and gas, hydrocarbon, fossil fuel, with the requirement of that Paris Agreement can be absorbed by the government. That will attract the investment. they will shift their priority from okay, I'm going to go for Indonesia as the heartland of investment. That's the challenge. So that's why we want to make sure this happens. Otherwise, maybe a number of major companies, they will go away. I don't want to invest something in the country. So, believe it or not, we are here. We have this pressure. We have to accommodate. We have to deal with it, right? Whatever instrument that we have in the fiscal policy, yeah, what we need then is the integrated carbon pricing policy that we can consider into our economic run. Otherwise, we only go from the split, the accelerated depreciation. We don't want to do that, but if we have carbon pricing policy, we have tax, but we have credit. Tax, but we have the credit. What will be balanced? That will help the upstream. So this policy need to be improved. We don't want to wait. Otherwise, 2030 is very close already. Not to mention, once we got the discovery, we got the more discovery in the next few years. Very soon. So we have to develop very soon. Of course, they need what government support that we can have to ensure that this project is feasible and for the investor. So that's the challenge. Andrew, we have right now. The government needs to sit down together, think about it. Otherwise, long-term plans is going to go away.
Yeah, understood. Pak Saleh, likes me. What would you say is the biggest challenge facing Indonesia in striking the balance?
Thank you, Pak Andrew. I think I'm going to add what Greg and Pak Fathar has said.
The transition is not a trend; is a fact. So you like it or we don't like it. There's a fact that we have to cope with that fact. Even now for industrial not
sectors,
on the oil and gas,
they also face the same issues. They cannot be competitive to export their product to Europe, for
when
instance,
they use a high carbon intensity electricity. So that's why we are talking about.
Now to reduce the electricity intensity on the system to allow.
What I'm thinking,
how to make the oil and gas industries
continuing in Indonesia
is following the international trend, where
if you see that global oil companies doing the transition,
they diverse their business, like Fathar said.
They are going to
renewable,
to mix between non-renewable and renewable industries. I understand many big oil companies. I don't know Repsol, but maybe some big companies already do that transition. This is the one option.
The one option that we can see.
The mix between.
I don't know how we deal with the scheme, the existing scheme, like cost recovery scheme, whatever. But this situation, we need to anticipate, Fathar. To give the upstream oil and gas industries competitive.
Secondly, I think
what we really need to consider is the
you need to the all option. The low emission technologies available that can reduce the cost. Because as like Repsol that you want to get the 1.5 degree pathway in 2050. I think must be associated with cost as well. And I don't know in Spain whether you have a lot of incentive from the government, or you do it mostly by your own expenses. You may tell us on that. Yes, I think Fathar
is right that under the cost recovery terms that the government has to do something to keep the upstream activities on track.
Attractive. I think attractive. I think
the government, our
ministers is always ready to,
like what is happening now.
Like what is happening now, that the government has already provided more and more incentive for the upstream oil and gas.
But the question is how low.
But the question is how far can we go with the incentive? Given the fact that the trend of the energy transition is a fact, not anymore.
So I think
secondly, maybe we can also talk on the carbon offsetting. I say that
the upstream oil
and gas industries can also develop the non-fossil industries.
Not only part of the carbon
offsetting, reducing the emission,
but also
can be your
So I think there are a lot
of possibilities that we can explore.
To keep myself optimistic,
I think Greg and Pat, to see these industries
contributing to our national economy.
Especially, Father said that
actually SKK is
asked to meet like 2 million
barrel per day by
UN.
Target is 1 million.
The target is 1 million. We have to be able to achieve that target, Pak Fatah.
Because that's a half
of the ruin target.
Anyway, I think that's what we
that's what we need to explore. I think the CCUS is part of that one. And whether you see that CCS is cost intensive, then you may offer another option using another low emission technology, whether the gas industry is integrated with hydrogen, for instance, or ammonia, as what Japan is proposing. So I think we see some bright horizon in front, in my opinion, that we can talk to keep these industries moving forward. That's my response, Pa. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks.
I think there's a lot of potential.
I think there's a lot of potential in carbon capture. I think
the right sort of commercial model to change it from being simply a sort of operational cost to becoming something that can generate revenue. I think that is yet to be determined, and a lot of that will rely on the sort of carbon pricing or the carbon policy that's implemented. Definitely some area of focus there, and perhaps an area where Indonesia can. It could be a huge opportunity.
It could be a huge opportunity for Indonesia to gain a sort of first mover advantage. There's not that many countries at the moment yet that are making a success of carbon capture. So there's a huge sort of goal there for Indonesia.
Pak Fatah, I wanted to ask you
around Indonesia's production targets.
Has SKK Migas done work, or given the sort of the 40% increase in oil, and the 116% increase in gas that we're targeting? Do we have a sense of what that will do for Indonesia's emissions profile? Are we looking at a similar level of increase in emissions, or how much do you think you can decouple emissions from sort of production growth?
Okay, to respond to your questions, Andrew, to be honest, when we generated this long-term plan, it was about 2 years ago, back in 2019. We didn't consider the emission as yet. Okay, so now with this requirement, of course, we're gonna rework on this particular one. For example, when we developed the Masela POD revision, right, we didn't consider the CCUS into the project. But now the requirement is there. Otherwise, the LNG price will not be competitive. And the financing, especially, they require all the investors, when they require fund from financial institution, they need the environmental impact assessment must consider the green production. That's a requirement. Otherwise, they cannot get the land. They cannot get the funding from the financial institution. So now they come to see us. So we need to do this. Now it comes to our next step. Oh, we didn't know yet. Masela is a good example, but the CO2 from the subsurface is not that huge, but only emission from the production facilities. Okay, so we need to do this for sure. The question is 40%. How much? You can look at if you put an average. Yeah, like CO2. If you're looking at 6 billion, yeah, 6 billion scf per day increment of the gas. If let's say 20% in average, you can imagine how much CO2 will have, right? So immediately you can consider this like almost 1 billion, 500 to 1 billion probably. CO2 will emit to the atmosphere. That's rule of thumb for the from the gas. For productions, maybe less than that. Yeah, because the product from the oil production is from the associated gas, and the fuel gas that they use, So in total, probably with that production, 1 million, I can see around 500 to 1 billion CO2 will be dealing with it. We will be dealing with it for the future carbon pricing policy. Roughly, we have to revoke this. Does it answer the question?
Yeah, so it just highlights. It just highlights just how difficult it is to balance, to balance that production with those emissions targets. I wonder if things are just working against each other here. I'd be interested to bring Ibu Laxmi in on this in terms of from an environmental perspective, or from the Ministry of Environment perspective. How does it see Indonesia's oil and gas production targets? Is it keen to see these targets met, or does that provide more headaches in how you can sort of meet some of these targets aligned with the Paris Agreement?
Well, yeah, thank you for the questions. Yeah, thank you for the questions. Well. Maybe headache. It's because it is our duty. It is our duty to ensure that the balance between the economic, social, and environment. So as I explained during my presentation, our scenario in NDC strategy, as well as the scenario for the long-term strategy and the low carbon resilience scenario. Scenario. We already accommodate and we incorporate several assumptions, the population assumption, the economic assumption, the growth, industry, and extra. With those assumptions, I believe what we are talking about, the target that we are talking about, it's still within scenario and within the assumption that we are using for our scenario. So I believe that the productions could grow, of course, with adopting the proper technology, low carbon technology, and changing the consumption and production pattern into more sustainable. So I believe the economic target or the production target will be achieved. In same time, it also achieve the NDC target. I think we are optimistic that every stakeholders, all the panelists today, I believe that the target, both the production as well as the greenhouse gas emission will be achieved.
Excellent. Thanks so much. I've got one question. That came in from our audience for you. It's a question around in support of the NDC targets. Has there been any, or will there be any sort of guidelines for the energy sector and the forestry sector to work together in terms of carbon offsetting, reforestry? Is that something that's being pursued at the moment?
I believe Ibu Masita mentioned a bit on the regulation that we are making. The government of Indonesia is preparing the presidential regulations on carbon pricing. So in Indonesia, we call it nilai economic carbon. the regulation will promote the implementation of carbon pricing in order to support the NDC's targets. So within the draft regulations that we are expecting to be soon finalized, government will promote carbon pricing schemes. The first scheme or mechanism is the carbon market, carbon trading. Carbon trading could be emission as well as emission offset. The second mechanism is result-based payment. The third mechanism is carbon taxation, but it's not merely only tax. It could be different type of taxations. We call it in Indonesia pungutan atas karbon. So it could be a levy, that kind of thing. And the fourth mechanism is the combinations. So within the regulation, the sectors in charge of the NDC sector will be given authority to choose, to select among the mechanism which one that will be suitable for their sector and subsector. Of course, the general guidance will be given by the Ministry of Environment and Forestry as the national focal point. We also provide the support system like the registry system, the emission reduction certificate system, and other kind of system. But the detail for the sector and subsector will be then elaborated by each individual sector. So one sector may apply various or combination of the mechanism that I mentioned. But currently, for the forest sector, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry as the forestry sector in charge will be prioritizing the result-based payment mechanism for achieving the NDC target within the forestry sectors. While I believe the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources currently having a pilot project for carbon offset for the electricity plant, something like that. But in the longer perspective, we may combine the mechanism among the sectors or between the sectors. We are preparing the guidelines. But the most important thing that every single entity need to be registered into the national registry system. Otherwise, there will be no acknowledgement from the system for any carbon pricing activities of the entities. Thank you.
Yeah, and just a follow-up question. I'd be interested to hear where you envisage which department, which ministry would things like the administration of a carbon taxation system or a carbon trading scheme. You've got different functions. You've got the administration. You've got the monitoring of emissions. You've got the sort of management of that and the management of trading. Where would that likely sit? Which ministry or which department would that sit under?
The presidential regulation, of course, still based on the current mandate and functions of each individual ministry. So for formulating and strategizing the carbon taxation, for example, the leading sector will be the Ministry of Finance. Of course, this ministry need to coordinate and communicate with Ministry of Environment and Forestry as the national focal point and the related sector. The regulation will set the so-called steering committee. steering committee.
It's national steering committee.
It's national steering committee, and within the steering committee there will be divisions.
Well, for example,
for developing the guidelines for NDC achievement, as well as the
carbon pricing mechanism,
including the MRV, the monitoring systems, as well as the registry. There will be under the national focal point, which is the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. But for the taxation will be by the Ministry of Finance. For the carbon exchange, for example, we have both the Financial Service Authority as well as the Ministry of Trade to formulate the carbon exchange system in Indonesia. So every single ministry will have their specific role and function in regard to the carbon pricing implementation in Indonesia.
Yeah, so it's a real coordinated effort. Multiple ministries sort of coming together to help implement the policy. I guess that means for investors, it's really important that they understand how to operate under different ministries, how to sort of coordinate their discussions with the different departments that will be involved. So, I guess that needs to be done as smoothly as possible, so it doesn't become a further challenge to the investment environment. Okay, thanks very much. Maybe jump to some more of the questions that have come in from the audience now, and if there are any further questions that people have, then please feel free to use the chat. Paksali, maybe I can start with you. There's a question here on what kind of I think we've covered this in a fair bit of depth, but maybe we can just cover it off again. What kind of fiscal and non-fiscal incentives do you think could be introduced to reduce the sort of oil and gas burden for CCUS? And also, is there a possibility that the government would encourage CCUS projects as mandatory or as a key part of sort of the development of future fields?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question, actually, Andrew. At this point, we still discussing that situation. But I think if we see that the government has actually been providing incentives actually for the AOR types projects, okay. Especially under the gross split, I understand that if you use either steam or whatever, carbon dioxide, you already have some additional incentive for that. Given that situation, I think in order these projects like what Fatar mentioned about the Marcella projects and other CO2 high content projects, from the gas itself, from the production. So I think we may see what is the situation. I mean, what is the technology offered to reduce the emission? That's from my perspective, from the CO2 reduction perspective. I think, of course, government is open to discuss any incentives that is needed by the oil companies, including perhaps when we discuss about the carbon pricing. I mean, I understand that in some projects that I follow the discussion in Tangguh, in Gundi, for instance, that if we can utilize the carbon pricing, then it will have some big impact to the economic viability of the project. Things like this, I think we need to see. We need to understand the real situation, and then we will come up with the clear regulatory framework to address that. One project will include the CCS or CCUS as a whole project. That's what my response this time, Pak Andrew.
Yeah, understood. I think.
Until
you have that
firm or clear
carbon
policy or carbon price in place,
CCUS
is ultimately seen as a cost.
Whereas if you have a carbon price
that you can measure that cost of CCUS
then
against,
it's not until you have that in place that you can actually see that you can incentivize that CCUS investment. Maybe Greg, you can pick up on that. I mean, from sort of Repsol's operations elsewhere, are there things to learn about how Indonesia can, implement carbon policy or carbon regulations?
Not so much within our
portfolio. I think Indonesia is one of the places we're looking to make a foray into that
and make something that actually
works.
Had a very major discovery.
We'd like to see it, developed
in an appropriate way.
In an appropriate way.
The challenge, of course, is when you talk about CCS, whether it's through a taxing mechanism or some other issues, how does it get paid for? Is the cost recovered? Is there some other revenue stream that's used to offset it? They're very important mechanisms
that go into that mix.
Cost of development,
along with cost of development, gas price, all the other sorts of things that normally feed into a
plan of development.
Under the Indonesian regulatory framework.
So, but it is becoming essential.
But it is becoming essential.
That's the important part.
I mean, that's the important part.
It's not there as a.
Say we're doing something nice. We want to say we're doing something nice and green. It's a barrier to us going forward. We can't articulate how we're going to make that work.
Which is okay. It's the
start of a process. At the start of a process.
But back to the first question, what can we do?
What can we do?
Progress it with some urgency.
Yeah, understood. What do we think? What do we think investors are looking for when it comes to this carbon policy or carbon regulation? What are the sort of key principles that investors are targeting or hoping for?
I forget which one of the team said it, but essentially it's certainty.
There's lots of different ways of doing this, but you need to know how it's going to work to be implemented.
And then, that's not just at the
sort of the fiscal end.
You also need to give the mechanical tools to let it be implemented effectively. Fatara was 100% right. SKK Migas, for instance, will implement the regulations they are given to implement. But they can't make up new regulations.
So they have to be given tools
and
to use. And as you described, we've got DMO, you've got these sorts of things that fall under that you can recommend on how to approach. But you can't
liberally go and execute
CO2 pricing scheme.
But you have to do that with the other stakeholders. And then, of course, imagine if we had solved and we decided we were going to put CO2 into the ground. How do we license it? What permits do we need? What safety checks are we doing?
To make sure it's there. Indonesia has the capacity to do this. It's no different than the oil and gas industry that's been so successful in Indonesia for so long.
The technical capacity is there.
The regulatory capacity is there. It needs that priority.
It needs to be given
the green light
and do this and not worry about
too much of
what exactly
it's going to look like.
Because a lot of these things are going
to be very
in
different.
The slides that Pat Fatah
said,
3 or 4 different fields.
3 or 4 different fields.
There could be 3 or 4 different solutions.
There could be 3 or 4 different solutions. It's easy to imagine.
You need to make sure that each one strikes the right balance.
Yeah, and I mean, if I can play devil's advocate for a moment, what would you say to people who think that because the likes of Repsol or a BP or other international investors already have these corporate targets? What would you say to people that think, well, why does Indonesia need to set its own regulations, its own policy? These companies already have their own sort of internal targets and policies.
Well, at the risk of sounding a little, we are just a company. We are not the state. Indonesia, we report as a contract at SKK Migas. We earn our contracts out of Migas. We provide almost a service to Indonesia. Go outside of that. There are requirements for us to get capital from our company to deploy or to get engineering resources to even study a project. Those things are becoming even scarcer in the transition world. We want to deploy engineers to go and look at renewable projects. So we've got a smaller pool potentially to draw from. We need to make sure that our projects, and speaking as a partisan supporter of Indonesian oil and gas and energy, I want to make sure it remains competitive.
Yeah, I think we'd all on that.
Yeah, Andrew, I think it is really important, especially for us, SKK Migas, to run this exercise with the operators. If we don't have a set of policy, we cannot move on. For sure, all the global IOCs, they have the same target already for this carbon. No doubt about it. We have to live with it. Otherwise, all these global IOCs, they cannot compete each other. But the thing is how the country can accommodate. Not only because of the corporate requirement, but this is the global requirement set by the environmental standard. So for SKK Migas, especially, that the jurisdiction of policies coming from the ministerial office, we need to align with them. Once we have regulations, make it mandatory, it's easy for us to see how we can put in place. Because this CO2 emission actually is dealing with the technology. That's it. How much cost do you want to spend? What is the right technology? What is the right solution to do it? Right? Greg just mentioned, if you want to inject a reservoir, do you have enough procedure? How do you want to ensure that there is no leaking from the reservoir? Those kind of standards need to be in place. Otherwise, we're not only talking about the carbon pricing, but the technology also need to get involved. You have the best technology that's very efficient. Otherwise, it's going to kill the project. Today, we are not only talking about the new equipment for this low carbon production facilities, but we are talking about the wells. We're talking about the pipeline. The cost, we challenge all the oil operators to ensure that we have a good revenue for government, also for the contractors. So this is only part of the exercise. Whenever we have the trade-off, you do the green project, you got the trade-off from the government. Okay, this is the carbon credit you have, less taxation, then we get the money from it. So we can run economic. Otherwise, we cannot use that. The only thing that we use is a flexible. We have to be flexible enough. Otherwise, you cannot unlock the resources.
Yeah,
and industries dealt with that before as well. I mean, you look at drilling. There was a time before people routinely put blowout preventers on wells. Doing that costs money. It doesn't increase production. It just reduces the likelihood of a catastrophic event. Now that is completely routine and standard practice. So in all aspects of our industry, we're always moving
the technological
goalposts and what we consider to be acceptable. Working out height, all sorts of things. Whichever particular standard or thing you want to focus on. I guarantee you the standards are different today than they were 20 years ago. This is just another function of that. However, one with a much more obvious and visible cost element, and it's a lot more novel.
Yeah, and I think, CCUS, CCS, many of these low carbon technologies are, to be frank, they're in the fledgling stage, right? This is technology developed, and it is going to be more costly at the outset, and gradually, as experience is developed and technology improves, then costs do come down. So, if Indonesia does want to capture a part of that potential CCS market or CCUS market, then arguably it has to be willing to support that investment upfront, and benefit from the longer term sort of impact of this technology and growing and being a key feature of Indonesia's upstream sector. We're just a little under 10 minutes to go, I think. So I just wanted to maybe pick your guys' brains on one last point around. I think we touched upon it, but I'd be keen to get your take on the timing of the implementation of some of this policy. Greg, you mentioned how time is essentially of the essence, and the faster this sort of stuff can be brought in, the better. We don't want to rush things, but maybe I can get the panel's views on when we're likely to see the introduction of some of these policies and regulations. Do we expect to see it within, for example, the current presidential term, or do we think it'll take longer to land upon the right set of policies and regulation? Sally, do you have a
perspective on that to begin with?
Thank you, Andrew.
I think
the situation is
becoming not easy in the future. That's what we understand. We have not much option available in our industry. However, we need to continue, I think, to find out the innovation
is key, I think, to let this business growing. And I think I understand that from some studies that the capture technologies is declining the cost. And also we are thinking about the CCS hub, things like that. So from multi-source, that I think some breakthrough that can reduce the cost. Now I think we, from the government side, we will speed up the regulatory process on the especially on the deployment of carbon captures. We're also thinking of how to make a balance, as you like, that, as you said, that increasing the production at the same time, decoupling it with reducing the emission. I think that's we need to think and learn, as Andrew asked Greg, on how we can learn from international experiences to make our regulation is internationally competitive with others. I think that's what we will work immediately to address that issues. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Pak Sally. Pak Fatar, Pak Greg, do you have any take on when we can expect to see some more announcements on the upcoming policy and regulation?
From our side is Andrew. I think let us see the upcoming project CCUS. As I showed to everybody here, the Jambaran Tiung Biru project. We're gonna capture CO2 and put a CO2 flooding. Let's see, it happens and successfully. We can sell success to others as a new technology as well. And upcoming project also in terms of the enhanced gas recovery for BP in Tangguh. So following to that, of course, Marcella, but there's still, a few years down the road, but very close is this Jambaran Tubuh project and some other small field. We expect that with this scenario that we plan to run and we have a successful result, maybe next time we can share and we can see some new technology development, especially how to capture this, as everybody is not clear yet, still ongoing, of this technology. So let's hope for the best from us.
Indeed. And Greg, I guess the timing has a direct impact on obviously Repsol's activities in Indonesia. So the sooner the better.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a key enabler. The timing I will leave to the panel is it's a matter of Indonesian government policy. But obviously we support that, and we're available for any support through the IPA Energy Transition Committee is a way of collaborating with IPA member companies. For instance, which we've been doing. I mean, we've met most of the people on this panel, I think, independently of that, and the conversations have been going in the right direction.
Great, fantastic. Okay, I think we've got a few more minutes left, but maybe I can just ask the panel to sum up their key takeaways from today's session in maybe a sentence or less. Who would like to give us their overview of what's been discussed today and their key takeaway first?
I'm the last, I think. That's what Patar start, maybe.
Okay. Yeah. I think we need to have a firm policy, integrated policy between the Ministry office that will make easy for the investment. So from our standpoint, we will need to make sure that the investment here is easy. So whatever we are facing, the pressure we have on the environmental, we can handle it by having this regulation in place. Everybody will feel secure in investing their money in Indonesia, including domestic investors. That's what we need.
Great. And Greg, your key takeaway for today?
I'm going to agree with Fatar, but that's exactly it. We need a framework that works. We want to make sure that there's a regulatory framework that's an enabler of investment, because the flip side is it will quickly become a barrier to investment for a whole range of companies and investors that Indonesia needs to attract to meet its energy goals.
Thank you. I think from me, we see that what we take note from this meeting is that we need the clarity on the regulation. That's number one, I think, and how to make this, if you like, low emission technology, promoted on the upstream oil and gas, what sort of incentives that needed. And I think we need to learn from outside the success story of the, say, for instance, the CCUS implementation. And I think we hope that with Pak Patar and we, Ministry of Energy, will work, I think with the support as well with the IPA. We're happy to see that IPA already established the energy transition, if I may correctly say, Pak Greg, and I met with the team. I think we are optimistic to provide the best option to our stakeholders in Indonesia. Thank you, Pak Andrew.
Thanks very much, Pak Sally, and thanks to everyone on the panel so far. I think for me, the takeaway here is, in terms of Indonesia striking a balance between its emission targets and its production targets, Indonesia has a lot of big sort of plus points, a lot of big advantages in being able to meet these targets. A huge market potential, a lot of resource with which to develop and meet those production targets. Huge levels of infrastructure as well with which to supply those resources to the various markets around the country and indeed to export those resources. You know, it's at the forefront in terms of emission reduction technologies. If we consider some of the CCS and CCUS projects that are being considered, you also have, you know, we've not even talked about things like geothermal and some of these other sort of low carbon sources of energy that Indonesia can use to perhaps offset its existing emissions. So, you know, huge advantages, huge potential. But I think the overwhelming message today has been that Indonesia really needs that clear and certain policy framework with which to operate under. And as Greg, I think, put it quite well, you know, things that, you know, can incentivize investment can also be a barrier if they aren't there in place, and can lead to Indonesia being less competitive and less able to attract investment. So it's, you know, it's great to see everybody sort of working together and focused on getting that policy framework right and in place in time. So thanks again to everybody who has who's contributed today. Thanks very much to my esteemed panel members. Thanks everyone. Thanks also to obviously the audience for joining in. Thanks to the organisers, and I'm left to say thank you very much to the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, to SKK Migas, and also to Kata Data for making this session possible. So thank you to everyone, and that concludes today's session.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Terima kasih Pak Andrew, Pak Greg, Pak
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you.